Hello, welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name's Toby, and today I'm joined by Linda Lammensalo. Linda is a knowledge broker at the Finnish Academy of Sciences and Letters, where she works in science for policy in general and specifically on the Phenomenon Maps project. Her academic background is in politics and sustainability, especially the societal impacts of climate change. She previously worked at the Finnish Expert Panel for Sustainable Development, one of Finland's science advice structures, and she's now one of the main contributors to the new Researcher's Handbook on Science for Policy, which was published by the Finnish Academy this spring and which we're going to talk about today. So Linda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I think knowledge broker is a pretty cool job title, but what do you actually do?
Yeah, I get that response quite often. Like, what does it mean that you're a knowledge broker? So basically what it means is that we facilitate the interaction and dialogue between researchers and policymakers, mainly civil servants, but also actual politicians. So we kind of act as an intermediary and support and facilitate that dialogue between the two at the science policy interface with different means. So in simple form, it's that.
Okay, and is that specific to particular subject areas?
We cover quite wide various topics, so we don't focus on any specific. Of course, my background is in sustainability, so I focus on topics related to that, but mainly it's whatever is relevant in the policymaking in Finland. So we try to provide researchers and policymakers in those topics, so whatever is topical in the policymaking arena in Finland.
And I suppose then that's part of where this researcher's handbook idea came from.
Yes, for sure. So we wanted to provide this kind of capacity building for researchers that are working or interested in this interface. So that's how we kind of started to work on it.
Okay, great. So tell me a bit more about the handbook in general and how it came about.
Yeah, I think why we wanted to work on this handbook is that we kind of recognize that there is this new way of capacity building or new need for new types of capacity building for researchers. And this need goes beyond science communication, where this capacity building has previously kind of focused. So to kind of explain what I mean by this is perhaps better to start with a broader context. So we have kind of evidenced or seen this emerging trend globally. Different actors are offering trainings or materials for researchers that go beyond this training for science communication. So the commonality is kind of this science communication 2.0. So it's materials that are challenging this linear mindset of how impacts work, how researchers engage in the science policy interface, looking beyond dissemination research output and engaging more broadly with stakeholders. So we've evidenced this trend, like young academies have provided courses on this science communication 2.0. And I think it's really tying nicely into this recognition that we're facing multiplicity of complex crises in the society, and we need to look broadly how researchers can have impacts on those and support policymaking in different ways. So that's kind of the broader trend. And then, of course, there is not really one size fits for all model for these trainings. So we wanted to bring it to the local context. So these examples are kind of from outside of Finland, and we were wondering, okay, how could we bring those trainings into the local Finnish context so they could be helpful and useful for researchers working here in Finland. And we started this kind of with offering couple hours or day-long workshops to researchers here. We worked with Young Academy of Finland to organize some of these workshops, and they were hugely popular. Some of them got filled in a matter of days, and we had really good discussions during those workshops with researchers, okay, this is exactly what is needed, is kind of broadening what kind of impact researchers can make and providing kind of tools and means of doing that in these capacity building trainings. But then, of course, instead of doing these ad hoc trainings, we wanted to kind of compile all those information into one cover in a easily accessible format. So kind of this handbook format that could be useful for researchers throughout Finland. And that's how we kind of started to build this handbook. And I should maybe mention that it's only one of our activities. So we've also partnered with other institutions like the University of Eastern Finland, where we did like a course for PhD students that's now actually available for every doctoral students through this fin.net. But then we've done similar courses with the University of Helsinki and then the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare. So it's kind of part of our capacity building efforts, but tying it into easily understandable entry point format that it can provide an entry point for someone who's interested in engaging in the science policy interface.
It's interesting that you frame it as like science communication 2.0, like a development and elaboration out of science communication rather than a whole different area in its own right. I think people often do regard it as a whole different area. So you have like the core work of a scientist, which is, doing science, doing research. And then you have several other, as it were, complementary activities, one of which is science communication now, or public engagement. And another one is science for policy, or policy engagement. And I agree with you that science communication is fairly well developed as a discipline. There's a whole bunch of scholarship and there are training materials available and so on. And maybe policy engagement is less well developed and hasn't had as much attention. But framing one as an extension of the other intrigues me. Is that an argument you're making yourself, or are you reflecting a more general understanding here?
I guess a bit of both. So I think there are a lot of materials already, like you said, on science communication. And I think that's something that institutions like universities have been quite good at providing to researchers. But what we're witnessing is like trainings that go kind of beyond that are perhaps lacking, or they're less readily available. So that's definitely what we wanted to do. But of course, like we wanted, or we see that, okay, like science communication is an important tool for increasing the impact of research, but then there's some things that you can build on, that there's overlaps with the skills and the kind of mindset. So we included, that's part of the handbook, but we also wanted to kind of contribute other ways and means of doing that impact work. So like a little bit of both, I'd say.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think we agree that there is less stuff out there to support science for policy than there is to support science communication, but there is still some stuff out there, right? So I'm interested to know what kind of materials that already existed you read or drew on to make your handbook.
Yeah, so we draw on a lot of the lessons learned from organizing these workshops and from the conversations that we had with researchers and then representatives from different institutions. So I think from those discussions, we learned what sort of elements are needed to be included in the handbook. But I think we were also really inspired by other organizations that have done this type of work. So, for example, the Zurich Basel Plant Science Center's workbooks on engaging in the science policy dialogue, they were really helpful for us. But then also the JRC's competency framework for researchers was actually how we started to think about this, like competency framework, that what are the elements that we want to include. And we decided to include good practices, expertise and understanding and build the content around this framework. So a little bit simplified version, but we were really kind of inspired by these international works that have been already done, and then wanted to build on them and tailor them to the local Finnish context.
Do you know this this Joint Research Centre competency framework? I think I end up recommending it pretty much every time I talk to anyone about science advice, or at least how to get started in science advice. It's such a useful tool. I just wish they'd come up with a more user-friendly URL, because the link to European Commission web pages is so long and human unfriendly. But I see
I
you
have,
solve that in your handbook with the QR code.
I was going to say, I have a tip, make a QR code of it.
Right, not that humans can read QR codes either, but I guess I could carry it around printed on a piece of paper or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And this brings me to an area that's a personal interest of mine, which is this question about how transferable these materials are from one context to another. Because talking in the past to people who work in different countries on science advice, including actually sometimes to your colleagues in the Finnish Academy, one point I hear made quite a lot is that local context really rules. You can't just take a report. I mean, we're talking about like science advice materials, actual piece of scientific advice. You can't just take something written for one country and give it to policymakers in another country or at another level or whatever. Even if the content in principle ought to be basically the same, localization always matters. And I'm guessing, you can correct me, but I'm guessing that you found the same thing with this handbook, given that you're not just dishing out materials from the JRC to all your Finnish researchers. You actually went to the trouble of writing a whole new book just for them.
Yeah, I think that's primarily the reason why we wanted to do it here ourselves, because we recognize the need that there are really good resources out there internationally, but we wanted to kind of make it suitable for the local context and the Finnish policy making landscape. And I think what we're witnessing in Finland, for example, is quite high levels of trust between researchers and policymakers, and I'd say also low levels of hierarchy. So, for example, researchers or research groups can be directly in contact with civil servants or with policymakers, and that's not necessarily the case everywhere in the world. So there are, for example, in the handbook, we provide concrete examples from researchers that have already engaged in the interface. And even from those examples, you can see that people have done this work already, and the low level of hierarchy is kind of our advantage or our superpower in a way that researchers can utilize. So it's really important to kind of adjust these capacity building materials to fit the local context. And this is something that we try to reflect through the examples or tools or the materials that we included in the handbook.
In which case, why make an English language version?
Good question. I think the primary reason for us was that we have a huge amount of talent of international researchers working in Finland who have very relevant expertise and skills that would really advance the science policy interface in Finland. And we constantly see that there is barriers to entry for them for these spaces because of the language barriers. And we want to be kind of challenging these barriers and kind of breaking them down. So, of course, when we are developing a material or handbook like this, we don't want to create more of those barriers. We want to provide the same tips that we have to the international audience here in Finland. But of course, it's really nice to see that it's now that it's been published in English as well, it's gaining kind of interest internationally as well. And we're really humble about that and want to hear if there is some things that may not apply in other contexts, or if there's some lesson learned from other contexts that could be applied to these materials or the trainings that we provide here in Finland. So it's kind of great to see that it's facilitating discussions elsewhere or outside of Finland, and we are hoping that we can learn from that discussion as well.
That's great. I don't think you need to be too humble, personally. I think it's actually a really good resource you've created. Obviously, there'll be a link in the show notes for listeners to appreciate it too. It does make you wonder how much of this stuff is being done also in other countries, but never kind of achieves escape velocity. Anyway, we've been teasing this for long enough now. Tell us a bit about the contents. What are the main points?
I would say there are three. So the first key message is kind of to institutions, and it's a clear message that there is need and interest for these new ways of engaging from the researcher's side in the science policy interface. But there's kind of lack of, or there's not enough of these capacity building activities from the institutions. So we hope that institutions could take these materials or develop their own to kind of support researchers in this new way of making impact that goes beyond science communication. So that's the first key message. Then the second key message is maybe perhaps targeted towards researchers more. It's kind of this like importance of finding your own impact pathway. And what I mean by this is that impact work might seem messy and confusing at first, but it's important to kind of like figure out what works for you, what motivates you, and what strengths that you have that you can actually utilize in this impact work. It's really beneficial because it will make the impacts work or engaging in societal discussion not only more fun for you, but also more engaging and motivating. That will like keep you motivated throughout the time, which is of course when your impact kind of increases if you stay motivated and continue to do that. And then the third message is perhaps to both of these, and it's kind of this message of leveraging the collectives. So I think there is a lot of room for research community to work together to kind of be united and amplify that message. And that's really, really important in today's day and age, when we have like rising levels of mistrust in science and misinformation happening. So I think researchers need to work together to amplify that message, because if they don't, then someone will take the room. So it's kind of harnessing and leveraging the collectives. And of course, this handbook is for targeting researchers. We're not saying that, okay, the other side doesn't need to develop their skills or competencies. It's simultaneously needs to happen. So we want to also develop similar tools or methods of improving the capacity of civil servants or policymakers to engage in this kind of interface. And actually, we are developing tools, for example, with the Finnish Prime Minister's office on how to specify knowledge needs. So these are not exclusive. They need to happen simultaneously. But this, of course, the handbook was the first step of like targeting this capacities of researchers. So
yeah, perfect. Okay, there's lots there. So I'm interested in this idea that you alluded to, well, a little bit just then, and also when we first started talking about there being new ways of engaging with policymakers, new ways to achieve impact. What are you contrasting those new ways with? Like, what's the old way of making impact that you're saying is now obsolete, or if not obsolete, only part of the picture?
Yeah, I think previously how the science policy interfaces worked is kind of this linear way at the end of the research project where the results have been made. Researchers kind of communicate on those and kind of convey them to the policymakers. Now what we're witnessing in the world is like need for having more continuous dialogue and more continuous collaboration with policymakers, but also with other stakeholders. So it's kind of this non-linear impact model that we're trying to kind of convey through the handbook. That's one of the key messages there, that it's really important for researchers to kind of be in collaboration with relevant stakeholders throughout the project, which leaves room for co-creation of knowledge. It leaves room for actually learning from the stakeholders throughout the research project. And because research does not happen in a vacuum, so it's kind of like leaving room for that.
You talk about leveraging the collective. Tell me a bit more about that. So in practical terms, suppose I am a lone researcher with an idea or with an ambition to interact with policymakers. How do I leverage the collective?
Yeah, I think what we mean by leveraging the collective is first like identifying who your key stakeholders are, also who's working on the similar topic. But let's say you're like interested in making impact on the municipal level. So then it's important to identify who else is working with municipal decision makers or a similar target group, similar stakeholders. Then also like who's working on similar topics. Maybe there are civil society groups that you can like kind of work together with. And I think the important message here with the leveraging the collective is that oftentimes, I think, especially with the science communication trainings, it might come across that, okay, you as a researcher need to be active on X or previous Twitter, or you need to write blogs or something like that, which is really important. But then it can be kind of sporadic way of making that impact. So when you're leveraging the collectives, you can actually make that impact work kind of more continuous. You work together so that different people are actually saying the same message. So then it can be more impactful in the long term. So that's kind of what we mean by that, and working together in with your research group and with other people who are researching similar topics.
Right. And I guess that's maybe less of a challenging thing to do in a smallish country with fairly low levels of hierarchy, as you say.
Yeah, I guess so. But I think there's still like, there's tendency of competition amongst researchers from different universities. So I think this is just like to amplify the message of working together. And then, of course, this brings to the importance of doing like multidisciplinary collaboration and working with different stakeholders. So.
So you have this big emphasis on researchers finding their own path, finding what works for them, which I think is really interesting and actually not something you see all over the place in these kinds of contexts. You mentioned already it's more fun and more motivating that way. And I guess as a third advantage, it might also make you better at your job, right? In the same way that a teacher who's keen on their subject and in the right career is a better teacher than one who isn't really motivated. But the impression I get from reading the handbook is that you go a little bit further than that. It's almost a kind of light touch careers guidance. You're not just talking about the best way to do science for policy work. You're also helping people to find routes for their own personal development. So is that something you put in there deliberately, or is it just kind of emerged as a theme? Or I suppose there's a third option. Am I just reading between the lines too much?
I think our primary emphasis there was that we wanted to actually like encourage researchers to work on this science policy or think about this engagement and their impact work. So it wasn't necessarily as a career guidance or how to, become a top impact person. So it was more on the building on those skills that will help you to be successful and make that impact, that will also keep you motivated and interested in the work for long term. So with that said, we did purposely want to include a lot of reflections on this that will kind of help researchers to, think about this. Where do they stand on this topic? What kind of challenges or issues they faced with this topic? And I think the reasoning there was that we wanted the handbook to serve kind of wide audience, and perhaps some of the more tools and tips and tricks that we provide are more useful for early career researchers. So these reflections, we wanted to be something that also more seasoned researchers who've maybe worked on this impact or done impact work for a long time, that they could find useful as well, because it's good to sometimes reflect and think about what your ambitions or what your goals or what you want to gain out of engaging in this line of work is. And also because I think that's something that we were witnessing is there's less of. So there might be these kind of instructions of how the decision-making process in Finland, for example, works, and it outlines that kind of really nicely. But then there's less of these reflective materials that researchers can really pause and think about, like, what is the right way for me and what is the way that I want to actually focus on.
And I mean, it's done in quite a fun way, this whole reflection thing. You've got a worksheet in the annexes which a researcher can just work through, and it asks you questions like, what are my areas to think about, and which of my research seems the most relevant here? And it makes people reflect on all these different areas. It's almost like journaling.
Yeah, exactly. We wanted to make it as interactive as possible, and I think there's often a lot. Like I'm a fan of journals as well, so I think there's a lot that you can kind of learn from yourself by just pausing and thinking about what's the thing for me that works the best. So that's why we wanted to make it as kind of interactive as possible, and also because some reflections might not work for others. So then there's a bit of, you can scroll through the handbook and find the topics that are most relevant for you, and then focus on those tools or examples or reflections that are covered in that section.
Perhaps linked to some of that, you also have a major point of emphasis. In fact, I think it's the first thing you say in the handbook, basically. The importance of thinking strategically. So what do you actually mean by that? What counts as more or less strategic in this context? And why do you emphasize this so much?
Yeah, so essentially, it sounds like fancy, but it's actually really simple. Is what we mean is that kind of identify the methods of engagement that both work you personally and that are kind of effective. So what are the strategies that have been proven to be quite effective in increasing the impact of research, but then also thinking about what are the like methods that are best suited to you, either through your skills or through your personality. Similarly to this, there is kind of no one size fits for all. So we wanted to provide tools to think about what is the one method or methods that fit a particular person who's reading the handbook. And we kind of outlined this strategic approach to impact work to 5 steps. And they're not necessarily, they don't have to be thought about in this order, but essentially what they are is first to recognize your strengths. So maybe you're extremely extrovert and you want to work with people and you want to have impact through conversations. If you kind of combine that to the next one, which is recognize your interests. So you want to work with, for example, with civil servants in the national kind of policy-making context. Then you might feel more inclined to actually like have workshops or have direct informal chats with civil servants, because that both plays to your strengths and is what you're interested in. And then the third one is to identify existing players. So this is something we previously discussed about thinking about who else is working on the topic. Are there other research groups that are kind of focusing on similar topics? Can you work with them? And then the fourth one is setting goals. So I think that's kind of easily forgotten, but it kind of helps to direct your work into certain direction. So you can think of like, what do I want to achieve? Do I want to, I don't know, have one informal chat with a civil servant who's working on the topic that I'm researching? So that could be a goal. And then when you achieve that goal, you feel more motivated actually to continue, like, oh, I ticked the box and I achieved what my goal was. And then the fifth one is choose how to interact. So is it that you're meeting directly with people, or do you want to participate in expert hearings, or what kind of methods of interaction do you want to utilize?
Yeah, and there's tons of this stuff in the handbook. It's really great. Another reflection I want to run past you. What you've written is quite supply driven, by which I mean it tries to kind of stimulate and improve the quality of the supply side of the science policy interface. And I think that's completely valid. And of course, the target audience is researchers, so it's not a surprise. But it's also, I think, to an extent, a consequence of the way you frame science for policy work as an outgrowth of science communication. And science communication, of course, as an activity is normally seen as science initiated. It's scientists seeking places where they can interact with non-scientists and engage with them. And it's striking, I think, how strongly that approach, which you have inherited, contrasts with another piece of guidance that's recently been produced on how to do science for policy, a handbook published by Science Europe, which we also covered in this podcast a couple of episodes back. And Science Europe's handbook says quite emphatically, actually, if you are on the supply side, don't even think about doing science advice unless you have got yourself an institutional mandate. I.e., don't be supply driven, at least primarily, be demand driven. That's it. There isn't a question coming, except I guess, what do you think about that difference?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think it's important that this topic is being approached from different angles. And I think what we are doing after this, or kind of the future of the handbook, so to say, is precisely going towards that direction, inspired by the work that JRC is doing in this kind of like mapping of the science policy ecosystem in different EU member states. We've been inspired by the work done in Denmark and Spain and Portugal and other countries as well. And we've kind of started this similar mapping of the ecosystem, science policy ecosystem in Finland. And of course, part of this is the capacity building and the system level perspective to this, and how the institutions collaborate in capacity building, and also how it's from the ministerial side. So it's something that we're working alongside it. And I think it's really important that it happens from both sides. So we need the system level institutional set up to change to support the capacity building, but simultaneously, because that kind of change happens slowly, and the societal challenges we're facing are happening right now, and we need to strengthen the evidence-informed policymaking right now. So we wanted to kind of provide some tools for researchers already who are working in this interface. So I don't think they're like exclusive. They complement each other, and it's really great that there are materials like Science Europe have developed.
Yeah, I agree they're not contradictory. It's just interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question on the content, maybe, although we'll see where this takes us. You identify 3 different roles that researchers can take: synthesizer, commentator, and advocate. Why do you draw that distinction?
Yeah, so we wanted to articulate different ways researchers can think about like their roles engaging in the science policy interface. We came up with the 3 that you mentioned: synthesizer, commentator, and advocate. And if I go this one by one, the synthesizer is a researcher, or a role where a researcher kind of communicates those research results. So, for example, like summarizes or compiles latest evidence in a understandable format, for example, using blog posts or like commissioned research reports. And this is particularly useful role when there is knowledge that is kind of available for a pre-identified need. So there is a clear need that evidence actually fits in. But then where it can kind of come tricky is that what if the need is kind of changing, or for example, you're a researcher in an expert hearing and the policymaker asks you a question that is not directly answerable with the summary that you provided. So then the commentator role can be more useful in that sense. And the commentator is one that applies research results. So kind of expert insights that are derived from research knowledge. And this could be like, for example, that there's research done in a different context. So then in this kind of, for example, expert hearing, researcher needs to apply that to a local context and kind of utilize their expert opinion in that. So it is useful in situations where the needs of the policymakers cannot be directly addressed with the existing research knowledge. So it needs kind of applying more. And then the third one is kind of this advocate role. It's a role where researchers can kind of like speak for a cause that they see that is important, and kind of back that with the research knowledge that they have and their broader expertise. So in this sense, researchers kind of utilize the research knowledge and what it says, but then they speak for a certain objective or what they see is impactful policy measure that is by the research knowledge supported. An example of that could be, for example, in Finland in the spring of 2024, over 500 Finnish researchers signed a petition for Finland's policy on EU's Nature Restoration Act. So that's something that was more, I guess, on this advocate role that they've commented directly on the policy making and what its objectives were.
Yeah, I mean, it might not be the most original contribution you're making, but I still think it's important to make that point, and you separate them quite clearly.
Yeah, they're not clear cut, the roles. Like one researcher might have different roles in different settings and it might change quite quickly even, but it's important. These roles, I think, help to understand what kind of position you're taking in different contexts and what kind of relation to the research knowledge and the evidence you have. So it's kind of a tool for self-awareness. And that's really important for kind of building trust. I'd say it's a building block of trust, of being aware of the different roles that you take. And I think vice versa, if you don't communicate on the role, it might hamper the trust in the interface. So that's why we articulated these roles.
Yeah, and I suppose one element of that is that by identifying these roles, it also helps you stop yourself stepping over into the wrong one, or at least doing it unconsciously, right? So you can be thinking, oh, hang on a minute, here I'm supposed to be the synthesizer and maybe I'm slipping into the advocate role and I don't intend to.
Exactly. And it's also maybe a tool that when thinking about what's your impact pathway, you might think that, okay, I do not want to be an advocate or I do not want to be a synthesizer. So it might help you plan your how you want to engage in the societal discussion.
That's careers guidance again. Anyway, I do want to give you a chance before we wrap up just to say a little bit about first, the reception of the handbook. How's it been received, both in Finland and in general? And also about any plans for the future of it. Are there any gaps that you weren't able to fill that you'd like to go back and fill in later? Or any ideas for version 2?
So I'll start with the reception. I think we've been really positively surprised. It's kind of first of a kind. It's not really perfect. We're already seeing if we were to do it again, we would change this and that, which of course is always, I guess, the nature of this type of work. But overall, we're really positive about the feedback we've getting, and we're still gathering it. And we are wanting to hear from readers. But for example, the Science Policy Journal here in Finland reviewed it and concluded that it should be integrated to all PhD programs. And then we're also hearing that impacts-orientated research programs here in Finland are having reading groups around it. So I think that gives an idea that it's needed addition, but of course it's just a starting point. And I think that draws to the gaps that we weren't able to fill. So I think there are a couple. So unfortunately, we didn't really delve deeper into the new frontiers kind of things in this science policy interface. So unfortunately, we didn't really cover that much, for example, the involvement of arts, how innovative relationship between science and arts can kind of facilitate dialogue and partnerships. So that's something that if we were to do it again, we would definitely include more of that. Although it's a starting point, I think this is an overall picture of topics that are relevant. But what we're hoping is that perhaps different institutions or different disciplines kind of take up on it and kind of develop it further, tackling their discipline-specific needs, because those, unfortunately, were not covered. So I think that's kind of our vision for the future, what we want to see it kind of building on or building towards to. part of what I already said is that we hope that these kind of new capacity building materials could be integrated into, for example, doctoral studies, or they could be integrated and they could be part of these doctoral studies programs. So they could be available for everyone. So that's something we also hope to achieve. But then I think we in the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters are really looking into the bigger picture, like I already mentioned, to start working on the ecosystem. So we're mapping how the ecosystem works in this capacity building arena, hoping to facilitate conversation on that, how we can together make the interface more effective from a systems level perspective. So that's our next step.
Great. Well, we'll watch this space. I do have one final question, and it's from a slightly more high level.
Okay.
Given that this handbook exists and that you wrote it, and also picking up on something you said a little while ago about wanting to kind of motivate people to get involved in science for policy work, I'm curious to know whether you think this is something for everyone. Should every researcher be thinking about these issues and be reading the handbook, basically? Or are you more imagining that there will be a select few who realise and are keen that their role is interfacing with policy and this is for them?
I think the reason why we wanted to make this handbook was that we recognize that researchers are kind of like facing multiple pressures from the academic line of work themselves. So we recognize that not everybody needs to be or is able to be engaging in this impact work at all the times, but there are many who are interested in and want to know and learn more about the different strategies and means of doing it. So that's the reason why we kind of wanted to make it interactive and engaging for different audience in that sense. And I think part of the reason is also that we do want to still encourage researchers to be active in this area, because if researchers are not active, someone will take the room. And I think we are seeing this in already, for example, in climate justice space, the businesses and industry are taking up room. And it would be really important that researchers are active, and that because it's needed to shape the society.
What a good place to finish. So I commend this handbook to our listeners. I think there's probably nobody who is choosing right now to listen to a podcast as geeky as this, who wouldn't also find it well worth their time reading the handbook. It's a great resource, and just as important, it has links at the end to a whole bunch of other great resources. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'll put a link in the show notes. And thank you very much, Linda Lammensalo, for taking the time for this conversation.
Thank you very much for having us.
The Science for Policy podcast is created by the Scientific Advice Mechanism to the European Commission. It's produced and presented by Toby Wardman, with additional editing by Nina Skorchak. The Scientific Advice Mechanism provides evidence-based expertise and policy recommendations to inform policymaking in the European Commission. This podcast is funded by the EU via the SAPEA Consortium. Our theme music is composed by Carlo Alfredo Piatti and performed by Elisaveta Shushenko.